Some machines are born great. Some become great in battle. And some tanks took too long to build, cost too much, and arrived too late. Precisely late enough to be useless at the moment they were needed most. The story of the Japanese Type 74 is the story of a country that turned caution into a system and perfectionism into a trap. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the very beginning. August of 1945 left a mark on Japanese military culture so deep that it shaped every decision for the following decades. A nation that had once built carriers and battleships capable of shaking oceans was overnight stripped of the right to even think about armed force. The American occupation did not simply forbid Japan from having an army, it rewrote the country's entire relationship with war. The pacifist constitution became not just a legal document, but something like a national philosophy. But history has no patience for philosophy without pragmatism. Already in the early 1950s, as the Korean peninsula turned into a collision ground for two systems, the Americans grasped a simple reality. Their Pacific stronghold was too vulnerable without a reliable ally on the ground. Japan was permitted to think about defense again. And so, in 1954, the self-defense forces came into being, along with a question that would haunt Japanese military engineers for the next 2 decades. What should a Japanese tank look like? The question seemed simple. The answer proved agonizing. The first thing Japanese tank crews received was American. Washington was generous with its surplus equipment. Light vehicles, medium vehicles, proven, reliable, many times tested in combat. American instructors smiled. Japanese officers also smiled, politely and with tension, because they understood something the Americans didn't want to notice. Japan is not Europe. The Japanese islands are 80% mountains, gorges, rice paddies, and narrow valleys where heavy equipment becomes a liability faster than it can demonstrate its power. Any machine intended to defend this land had to be designed specifically for this land, and no other. A particular urgency came from Hokkaido, the northernmost of the main islands, separated from Soviet Sakhalin by nothing but a narrow strait. The Soviet Union kept substantial armored forces there, and Japanese strategists understood perfectly. In the event of war, the first blow would come from exactly that direction. They needed their own equipment. In 1961, Japan took its first step, adopting the Type 61 tank. By late 1950s standards, it was a respectable design. The engineers could be proud. A country that had been forbidden from having an army 7 years earlier had independently built a fighting vehicle. But the triumph didn't last long. The development of the Type 61 had taken too many years. While the Japanese methodically refined the design, the Soviet Union wasn't standing still. By the time the first production machines rolled off the line, Soviet tank divisions were already re-equipping with the T-55, a machine of an entirely different generation. And on the horizon loomed the T-62, with its smoothbore gun capable of punching through armor that Japanese engineers could only dream of matching. That was a brutal lesson, and the Japanese learned it. In 1965, the military command made a decision. We will not modernize the Type 61. We will build a new tank, from scratch, on entirely different principles. There were voices suggesting they simply put a more powerful gun on the existing chassis. Cheap, quick, obvious. Japanese engineers listened to these proposals politely and declined them just as politely. They asked themselves a different question. What can a Japanese tank do better than any other tank in the world? Not heavier, not faster on a highway, simply better, in the conditions where it would actually have to fight. The answer came from the nature of the Japanese landscape itself. Any tank placed before a hillside finds itself in the same situation. It can look up or down only within the angles built in by the designers. To fire from behind a ridgeline, stand up fully and expose your sides. The entire world tank industry accepted this as a given. Japanese engineers decided the given could be changed. Every road wheel of the new suspension was mounted independently and could rise or fall on the driver's command. The whole tank could change height, lean forward, backward, left, right, like a living creature adapting to the terrain. The standard ground clearance of 400 millimeters could shift by 200 millimeters in either direction. In practice, this meant the following. The tank would move up a reverse slope, conceal its hull behind the ridgeline, lean forward, and expose only the top of the turret and gun. The machine fired, then pulled back, disappearing before the enemy had time to understand where the hit had come from. Soviet tank crews accustomed to fighting with mass and momentum would have faced an opponent that was almost impossible to locate. Work on the armament proceeded in parallel. 105 millimeters, the caliber that had become standard in the North Atlantic Alliance, gave a real chance of defeating Soviet equipment with the right ammunition. Many argued that the Japanese simply copied the British L7 gun. That is inaccurate. The barrel was made compatible with standard ammunition, but the breech, the recoil compensation system, and the recuperators were entirely the designer's own work. For the Japanese defense industry, this distinction was fundamental. The country was proving it could create weapons, not just copy them. To the gun was added a fire control system advanced by the standards of the 1960s. A laser rangefinder measured distance automatically. The ballistic computer calculated corrections on its own. The gunner only had to lay the crosshairs and press the button. In an era when most tank crews around the world were still estimating range by eye. Testing went on for several years. 6 prototype vehicles of the STB series were built in total, each differing from the previous one by dozens of changes. In 1972, one of the prototypes was shown to the public. Japanese people accustomed to the angular silhouettes of American machines saw something entirely different. A low-slung, dynamic design with smooth turret contours. The press wrote of a triumph. Nobody was in a hurry to talk about the problems. But there were problems. The engine, under prolonged operation, began to act up. 750 horsepower proved too great a strain on the transmission. The output had to be reduced to 720. The loading assist mechanism, which allowed a shot every 4 seconds, was deemed too expensive and removed, shifting the workload back to the loader. The transmission was simplified. In 1973, the vehicle was accepted into service under the designation Type 74. Series production at the Mitsubishi plant began in 1975. Each machine was assembled essentially by hand. The hydraulic suspension required such precision that a production line approach was out of the question. The result was a price tag that took parliamentarians' breath away. Critics asked, why spend such money on a domestic tank when you could buy a proven one from allies? The military replied with an argument that resists easy quantification. A domestic defense industry is not a line item. It is the foundation of technological sovereignty. The argument was correct, but it didn't make the problems disappear. Production ran for 13 years. In that time, 893 tanks rolled off the line. And here, the story of the Type 74 takes on a genuinely bitter tone. While the Japanese were refining their machine, the Soviet Union was re-equipping with the T-72. This vehicle carried a 125mm smoothbore gun, against which rolled steel armor became a purely symbolic obstacle. The Japanese had designed their machine to fight one generation of Soviet tanks. By the time the last Type 74 left the factory floor, that generation had long given way to the next. History repeated itself with surgical precision. Attempts to correct the situation were made. Subsequent modifications received new ammunition, camouflage paint, a thermal sleeve for the barrel, night vision equipment, mine plows, and smoke grenade launchers. The last attempt, a modification with a thermal imaging sight and explosive reactive armor. 4 prototypes were built. Then, someone added up the cost of upgrading the entire fleet, and the program was closed. The money would allow them to start building the next tank instead. That tank was already in development. The result was the Type 90, with a 120mm gun and composite armor that matched the best Western machines. It entered service in 1990, And 1 year later, something happened that no analyst had predicted. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. The threat for which all these machines had been created vanished overnight. The Cold War ended quietly, without tank battles on Hokkaido, without the apocalypse both sides had been preparing for. The Type 74 never fired at a living enemy. Not once. These machines spent their entire service life on exercises, demonstrating to journalists the signature trick with the hydraulic suspension, the way the tank bows, crouches, tilts, as if performing a ritual greeting. The machines grew old, broke down, and gave way to newer ones. Today, a few dozen Type 74s are still listed as active, seeing out their last years at bases where the repulse of an invasion that never came was once rehearsed. Soon, the last machines will go to pedestals or to the smelter. 20 years of development, 893 machines. A tank that was obsolete before its production ended. A threat that disappeared before its service ended. Japanese engineers would probably answer differently. They created the country's first fully original fighting vehicle with unique tactical capabilities. They developed a hydraulic suspension that became a reference point for designers around the world. They trained the generation of engineers who created the Type 90. In that sense, the Type 74 fulfilled its mission, just not at all the one it was built for.